Well, hi guys, Mark here again, and this is episode 56 of Re-examining the End Times, and we are working through the lens of my 2024 book, The Threshold of Exile. Love to have you pick up a copy. It's available on Amazon as well as Ingram Spark, and we are now in the book of Revelation. This is part 4 of the book of Revelation. Part 1 was some backstory on how I came to some of my conclusions and understandings of eschatology. Part 2 deals a lot with the Olivet Discourse. Part 3 deals with the subject of eternal destiny and how our understanding of the context of the New Testament shapes both the idea of the return of Jesus as well as eternal destiny. And then finally now, how does the book of Revelation how do we deal with the book of Revelation in light of these things? And so we've been going through a number of things in Revelation. We've gone through basically chapter by chapter. I haven't gone into a verse-by-verse absolute detail on everything in Revelation. We're trying to see if we can see a first century context here, and I think we've enumerated a number of things, and I apologize to some of you who may be starting to get familiar with this, but some people are just seeing these things for the first time. And so I do like to review a bit and make sure that people see some of the things that we've highlighted. And of course, it goes back to the beginning of the book. John is told that these things are urgent, they're going to come to pass soon, quickly. And almost like a set of bookends, he's told the same thing in the book of Revelation, that these things are going to come to pass shortly. And so we're questioning whether or not these things are things that are going to be in our future here in 2025, almost 2026, or if in fact the majority of what we read in Revelation, and for that matter back on the Olivet Discourse, are things that actually took place in history, and they pertained to the time of crisis and tribulation that happened following the death and resurrection of Jesus, the arrival of the Holy Spirit, the ministry of the apostles, and then the looming destruction of Jerusalem, the city and the temple, by the Romans in the Jewish-Roman War. And that's kind of what we have tried to see in these texts is that historical context really feed into the narrative that this is all stuff that's being described that occurred in the first century. And so we've gone through a number of different observations through these texts to see that first century context. And now we've been in this wild and mysterious section of Revelation in 17, 18, coming into 19 about the harlot riding on the beast. Who is this harlot? Who is this beast? And what are these outcomes that John is describing for us? And I feel like we put forth some pretty good descriptions or pretty good proofs of the fact that this first century harlot that we see is really first century Jerusalem, this ancient harlot, and in chapter 17. And that's critical, because if ancient Jerusalem is actually the harlot, if she was standing when John saw this revelation and is about to be destroyed, then that certainly puts an interesting twist on the book of Revelation. And it's very popular to say that this all happened or was written in the time of Domitian, which is 25 years later in the mid-90s during his reign, all this bloodbath of persecution and everything. And then he's describing some future tribulation and future Antichrist and future beast and all this. But if this is in fact, if Revelation 17 and 18 is in fact describing Jerusalem as the harlot and the beast, which would be the Roman Empire at the time, and then this beast turns and destroys this harlot city, that all feeds into a pre-70 AD narrative. And I try to suggest that I think there's a pretty good argument for this being seen and written before 70 AD, somewhere even probably between 64 and 68. And there's a reference to the sixth king who was, and we mentioned that the emperors that were in existence through that time, beginning with Julius and ending with Vespasian, and then ultimately Titus, was the seven-headed beast, okay, the beast being Rome, and these seven heads were the emperors, and the 10 horns tie us back to Daniel chapter 7, where he saw this fourth beast arising after Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. This fourth beast was Rome, and it had 10 heads. And each of our illustrations, or each of our images of the beast in Revelation, chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 17, this beast always has 10 heads, and that kind of refers us back to that time. And so we saw with this harlot that the prophets, of course, described Israel as a harlot. Matthew 23 is very explicit to saying that upon that first century city would be she would be responsible for the blood of the prophets and the martyrs. And here's how we see this harlot in Revelation 17. She's drunk with the blood of the martyrs, and then going on, she's riding on the beast. One of the things that strikes me about this image of her, John seeing her in 17, and it says that she's riding on this beast, coming up out of the wilderness, riding on a beast. And this idea of the wilderness harkens back to Exodus 19, where the Lord says, "I bore you on eagle's wings out of they took them out of Egypt." And they went to the wilderness to prepare for their journey into the promised land. And here we see this woman, this harlot, Jerusalem, is in the wilderness, but rather than heading toward her promise, her long-awaited promise of the new economy in the Holy Spirit, which was one of her great expectations and hopes, here she's actually now sitting on the beast. What a contrast from being found in the wilderness, having been born out of Egypt on the wings of God as an eagle, to now coming out of the wilderness in this new economy, or this new arrangement. As she's being prepared for destruction, she's coming out, she's riding actually on the beast. She's found herself in league with the beast. The beast itself, there's a lot about the 666 thing. And, if you go through and you look, everybody from Donald Trump to the Pope to who knows what, Henry Kissinger at one time back in my younger days, it was all kind of tied to this mysterious 666 number as being the quote-unquote Antichrist. We've discussed already that the Antichrist is only mentioned in 1st and 2nd John, has nothing to do with what we're seeing in Revelation directly. The Antichrist was a spirit that arose out of the church seeking to entice people away from the truth to an alternative gospel, and that's what John says is the Antichrist. As far as this beastly figure, there are Nero's name figures out in the Hebrew gematria, which is, of course, the use of numbers as letters, or letters as numbers, I'm sorry. Nero's name works out. Many in the early church believed it was Nero. Even the Latin translation uses 616, which is Nero's name. In Latin would be 616 using the gematria. Titus' name, I understand, works out, but mainly it's the fact that this is a Roman beast. Okay, and that explicit understanding was who actually is, or what actually is 666, I don't think is all that critical to our understanding. We have so much, we may not know exactly what it means. We may never know exactly what it meant. But we do know that so much of Revelation, this beast is Rome, and this harlot is Jerusalem, and this is all occurring at the verge of her destruction. And so whether we know precisely who's who in exact sequence, or who gets this designation or who gets that, I think is secondary to the point that we need a starting point. We need to understand that there's so much in Revelation that lends itself to a first century fulfillment. And I think that's what we need to get our arms around first. Now, the scholars will give us tons of information about how to decipher that 666, and some believe one way, some believe another. But ultimately, we have this beast. It has 10 heads, as Daniel did. And even as we saw in Daniel, there were 10 heads, 10 horns, and then another popped up, which is the 11th, which we suggested was Titus. And he moves 3 out of the way, which leaves a total of 8 horns, or eight heads on this beast. 8 leaders on this beast, which is exactly what we see happening in Revelation chapter 17. The beast comes out of the abyss. John doesn't even mention the 3 that were interim emperors after Nero's death, and then he describes an 8th in chapter 17:11. So you have the 8 eight heads, or the eight leaders that are consistent with what Daniel saw. So this is all informed by Daniel 7, a fourth beast having set 10 leaders. 3 are pushed out of the way. John pushes them out of the way in his description. And so now we have 7, and he says there's a beast coming out of the abyss, and that beast is also an 8. This is all what's described for us in chapter 17 of Revelation, as we get the description of both the harlot and the sea beast, okay? And as we've said in the past already, that has nothing to do with the land beast that's described in Revelation 13, because the land beast is the what we said was the Sadducees, who were pro-Roman, who were doing everything they could to promote peace with Rome, rather than the rebellion that was going on. And it was interesting because we noticed also in Revelation 13 that this land beast had 2 horns. It spoke. It appeared as a lamb, but spoke as a dragon. And so we thought these 2 entities are represented by those 2 horns. One was the Sadducees, the Jerusalem elite, but the other was the leadership in the land of Israel, the Roman leadership, who was in league with these Sadducees, and together they were trying to maintain their economic and political power interests in Jerusalem and in the land of Israel. And interestingly enough, we'll see that this whole land beast, who was later designated as the false prophet, they're going to be thrown out. They're going to be thrown into the lake of fire. Interestingly enough, the Sadducees actually disappear from history after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. So that's kind of an interesting end to that party and that influence that they had with Jerusalem destroyed. They no longer have a seat of power and influence. So a lot going on there in 17. And of course, I'm only kind of skimming the surface because we have gone through all this. And if you want to see it in better detail, I encourage you to pick up the book and read it. That way you'll have actual work in front of you that you can refer to. We mentioned that the 8th leader, the small horn of Daniel, this is Titus. And I believe Titus is the destroyer, and he's designated that both in Revelation 9, where we see him coming up out of the abyss and a huge army coming to destroy Jerusalem. There's a 5-month siege that's we see in Revelation, and we see so much about Roman artillery and with the catapults and the scorpions and all the different things and their armor and all kinds of things that are described in Revelation 8 and 9. And then we see this Titus coming up out of the abyss. And so he's later again mentioned here in 17, where we're told that he was and is not and about to come out of the abyss. And I tried to encourage you to understand that if we're really going to understand this crazy riddle in Revelation, we have to look beyond just the leaders and understand that when Nero died, or at least toward the end of his life, this empowering spirit, this evil spirit that had a hold of him, that he was hosting, was sent back to the abyss. It may have been Nero, or may have been an earlier emperor. It may have even been someone in Israel's past. Some scholars have suggested that it could have been Antiochus Epiphanes. But it's accepted by several scholars, George Eldon Ladd as well as Greg Beale, both very popular and well-respected scholars, have suggested that this was a beastly spirit that was previously in another antagonist of Israel and was sent back to the abyss, and now he's come back out in Titus, and that's why we're told in 17:8 that the beast is not, and is about to come out of the abyss. Now this is important. The word there is mellow in the Greek. It means something that is on the brink of happening. So when John saw this 8th emperor is coming up out of the abyss. It's not something that's happening way off into his future, some revived Roman Empire or whatever kind of nonsense is taught today. This is a beast. This was a spirit that was about to come out of the abyss, okay? And this spirit landed on Titus. He's the destroyer. He's the one that was sent to destroy Jerusalem. He hated the Jews and the Christians in the same way that Nero did, okay? And his goal in the destruction of Jerusalem, we discovered, was not only to destroy Jerusalem and the Jews, but in doing so, he felt that he could put out Christianity as well, okay? So whether or not he directly persecuted Christians, his intent was to wage war with the Lamb, we're told in Revelation 17. So his interest in destroying Jerusalem was not so much just Jews. It was what was behind it is this demonic spirit, this beastly spirit, this destroyer, whose interest was to not only destroy Jerusalem, but put Christianity out of commission for good. Okay? Now we come to Revelation 18. Revelation 18, now we've had a description of these beastly figures, but now, but we learn here in 17, chapter 17, God has put it in their hearts, that is the beast and the 10 horns, who are 10 allied nations with Rome, to put it in there, to execute their common purpose by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. And the woman you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And also, I should have read 16 as well, that the horns that you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked, and they will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. This is just a vivid description, graphic description of Rome now turning on the beast, or the beast turning on Israel, turning on Jerusalem, and she has become a nuisance. This rebellion that the zealots have been engaged in. It's just enough is enough. Okay. Before his death, Nero gives the order to destroy the city, sends Vespasian's northern campaign, the 1/3 of Israel, of the land of Israel, is being destroyed, as we see in Revelation 8 and 9. This 1/3 is 1/3 of the land. It's the Galilean campaign. If you look at a map, you see Galilee, Samaria, and then Judea, these three main regions of the Holy Land. And so this 1/3 destruction comes by Emperor Vespasian. And then after Nero dies and the empire goes through all of this chaos and near death, which is described as one of the heads being wounded, mortal head wound in Revelation 13. And then here in Revelation 17, we're told that the beast was not and is. So that's Nero's death, the beast going back to the abyss, and then coming back out in Titus to destroy, with the mission to destroy the city. So it's a spiritual power. Very important to remind ourselves it's a spiritual power, okay, a spiritual battle that's going on here. We don't want to just look at people, okay, and that will become very crucial very shortly here. But now in Revelation 18, we are reading the dirge for Jerusalem. And by the way, I should mention that in Matthew 22, 1-14, we have a parable, and Jesus says in 7, in fact, let's just read that very quickly. The parable of the marriage feast, we have the king giving a dinner, and he's got everything ready, and they didn't pay any attention. Of course, he's speaking here of the Jewish nation. He came to his own did not receive him, we're told in chapter 1 of Gospel of John. And then but not only did they not pay any attention, they seize his slaves, they mistreat him. Then it says that the king was enraged in verse 7. This is a critical verse. The king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire, and then tells his slaves to go out and just go worldwide and send invitations out to everyone. The fact that the king now sent his armies to destroy the city. See how critical that is. This is Jesus sending his own army to destroy the city, okay? And that happens before the gospel begins to go out to the Gentiles now. So the city is being destroyed. This is Jerusalem. This is what we're seeing. This harlot Babylon is now going to be destroyed, and there's a dirge. And we see that Babylon has fallen in verse 2. It's become a dwelling place of demons, and much like Jesus said would happen, that when in Matthew 12, when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, returns back, if it finds his house swept and garnished. Israel did not fill that with anything. They didn't fill it with the gospel. They didn't accept the new gospel. And so now Jesus said this will be the same. This is what will happen to this generation. Okay, so we see the nations having drunk the wine of the passion over immorality, and in 18:3, we're told God's people are told to depart. 18:4-8, And of course, that's not just get out of Jerusalem. That's emotionally and spiritually. It was time for them to now to walk away from that old covenant world and all that it was represented by the temple, because that's no longer going to be a central place in God's new economy. See, this destruction was necessary because God was not going to share the work of the blood of his son with a system that was dependent on the blood of bulls and goats and those kind of rituals, you see. It had to come down. It was time for that to completely be destroyed so that Jesus could emerge, the sole possessor, the sole heir of the kingdom, and that all that would come to him would be part of this new economy, so that he wasn't going to compete with this old system, see. So the people of God are told to get out of there. If you don't get out of the city, Jesus had told them that back in Matthew 24. You see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Get out of the city, all right? Because this is going to be the time of her destruction, okay? And so this judgment is coming, and then as we go farther in Revelation 18:9-13, we get all this lament and mourning among the nations, and very interesting, by the way, if you look at some of what in Israel's description of all of her merchandise and all her beauty. I just have some information here I'm going to run by, if you don't mind, for a minute or two. But some of the cities and regions involved that were involved with trade with Jerusalem in the first century. Joppa was a seaport. It was an entry point for pilgrims and traders who were linked to Jerusalem by specific roads, Beth Oron Ascent Road. Gaza was a thriving port and a conduit for goods arriving from Africa and Arabia and India. Caesarea Maritima was another port where international trade passed through. Tyre and Sidon, of course, the Phoenicians, were known for their dye and glass industries, supplied materials like cedar and wood for the temple, and facilitated sea trade with other Mediterranean areas like Cyprus and Greece. Damascus was a major nexus. A king's highway passed through there. And a little bit more, just to see the extent of this. Petra was a middleman for goods like frankincense and spices coming from the east via Arabia. Alexandria, Egypt, goods were transported from Alexandria to ports like Joppa or Gaza, and then overland to Jerusalem. Grain as well. There were international partners. Rome, the Roman Empire, they imported goods from Italy, finished metal goods, various textiles. Greece and Cyprus traded pottery and manufactured goods. Arabia and India, luxury goods like spices, gems, ivory, incense, on and on. And matter of fact, in Parthia and Mesopotamia, the trade going through there actually brought in silk from as far as China. And so what we're seeing here, okay, is the fact that there was Judean and Israelite cities and cities of the nations who were part of this whole trade network by which Jerusalem was involved. Jerusalem, Samaria, Bethlehem, Jericho, Decapolis, the 10 cities, the Greek cities on the east of the Jordan, Caesarea, Sepphoris. These were all cities and nations that were involved. And we get this amazing description here of Jerusalem's trade and all the nations that would be affected by Jerusalem's fall, you see. And it was just there. We see them lamenting, and they're throwing dust on their heads. Now that's interesting as they watch her fall, because not a custom that you see much of today. But in that ancient world, it was, mourning was characterized by people tearing their garments and throwing dust over their heads. Okay, so again, we have this first century picture, and they're crying out, woe and woe to the great city, and all the ships and all the merchants and all the cargoes will be no more. See, and then one other interesting little tidbit of information, if I may, it says in verse 14 of Revelation 18, he says that the fruit you long for has gone from you, and all the things that were luxurious and splendid have passed from you, and men will no longer find them. Interesting that it says that the fruit Israel longed for is now gone from you. If you wanted to turn for a moment, if you have your Bible, if not, you can just listen. But in Romans chapter 10, I'm sorry, Romans chapter 11, which I believe is a first century discussion, which we won't get into right now. I do get into it with the book right now a little bit. But in verse 7 through 10 of that chapter, he says, What then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained, but those who were chosen, that is the remnant of Israel, the first century remnant, which we saw in Revelation 7 and 14, they have obtained it, the rest were hardened. Just as is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, and down to this very day. And David said, let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened and see not, and let their backs and bend their backs forever. And I say they did not stumble so as to fall, but may it never be, but through their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Now, what Paul is writing here, he says the fruit, what John sees is the fruit you wanted, you longed for, the hope of this promise of the Spirit and the renewal that you longed for has not come to you. And we read it again here in Revelation, what the fruit you longed for has gone from you. Okay, that hope. Instead of as you rode out of Egypt on eagle's wings, now you're sitting comfortably on the top of the beast, Rome, the Roman Empire, who are using to do your bidding for you, to kill the martyrs and the saints of Jesus, and you're drunk. You're being held responsible, as Jesus said in Matthew 23. You're being held responsible. And again, I want to remind you, this is first century Israel, first century Jerusalem. It has nothing to do with Jews today, okay? God isn't holding Jews today responsible for anything back then, any more than he's holding me as a Roman, as Italian, responsible, okay? And so we have this mourning, this lamentation, this great lamentation over the city who has prostituted herself from once being the holy city and a temple that was meant to honor God, has now become a pagan-like center of merchandise and banking and trade, and she's designated as a harlot. And what a contrast, to God having designated her as such, now to be found as just this center of harlotry and merchandise. And in Jesus' words, we've gone back to them a couple of times, when he went into the temple with a whip and of cords, and he turned over the temples, and how zealous and angry he was over what they had done to his father's house. You have made it a den of thieves. You have made it a house of merchandise. You've made it a house of trade, just like the pagan temples around you, you see. And so it's a sad state of affairs in this great. And again, I've chosen not to go down this thing verse by verse, but a couple more texts that we would find interesting is that Jesus mentions in Matthew 18:6. He said, if you say to this mountain, and he's standing right at the outskirts of the city of Jerusalem, if you say to this, if you say to this mountain, be lifted up and cast into the sea, it'll be done. And here we see, he's talking about Jerusalem, and here we see the same thing happening in verse 21. The strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea. So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no longer. In other words, she's thrown into the sea. She becomes lost in the sea of the Gentiles and of the nations, all right? This once central focus, this one place where God had decided to make for himself a place of holiness, a place where he could be accessed and known, is now just only good for just being thrown out into the sea and to be dissipated among the Gentiles. And then one last thing I want to point out about this also is that in Jeremiah, well, let's read 18:22 and 23. I hope you're able to follow me here. I know I'm jumping around a lot, and I'm giving you a whole bunch. This is sort of almost like a shotgun. But he says to her, the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpets will not be heard in you any longer, and no craftsman or any craft will be found in you any longer, and the sound of the mill will not be heard in you any longer, and the light of the lamp will not shine in you any longer, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will not be heard in you any longer, for your merchants were great men of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery, and in her was found the blood of the prophets and of the saints and all of those who have been slain on the land. And now, this has been brought up and stated several times. This is what was found in her, and it said, your version might say, have been slain on the earth. Jesus made it clear it was those slain on the land. It's those slain on the gay. Was not holding the nation responsible for all murders and death in the world. He was holding them responsible for the blood on the land, okay, for the blood that they had shed, that Jerusalem had shed, the blood of the prophets, the blood of the righteous, the blood of the apostles was all found in her, see? As her foundations are uncovered and the city is destroyed and it's almost like underneath this foundation they find the blood, the dead of all of the righteous that God had sent to her that she did not receive. But notice that this whole thing about the sound of the bridegroom and the bride this is not going to be heard in you anymore. But I want you to look at Jeremiah chapter 7 for a moment. Jeremiah prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? Prophesying, very important, prophesy, context here. These are not just verses spoken out into air without meaning. There's a context here. Jeremiah 7, and I think it's verse 34. Yes. Notice what he says. This is very similar to Revelation 7:18. The dead bodies of this people will be food for the birds and the sky and the beasts of the earth, and no one will frighten them away. Then I will make to cease, get this, from the cities of Judah and from the streets of Jerusalem, the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, and the land will become a ruin. This is precisely what John's telling us in Revelation 18. And if you want one more, just to substantiate that, go to Jeremiah actually repeats this in Jeremiah 16, where he says, that's verse 9, he says that, for thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I'm going to eliminate from this place before your eyes and in your time, he's telling Israel at that time, the voice of rejoicing, the voice of gladness, the voice of the groom, the voice of the bride. And so John is literally being given to quote right from Jeremiah, which in context is speaking concerning the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar and the Chaldeans, okay, the Babylonian Empire. And as I've been saying all along through this entire book, and through my entire discussions, that the core meaning of what I've tried to get across through the book, the name of it, The Threshold of Israel, or Threshold of Exile, is understanding how these New Testament texts mine the Old Testament scenarios, the Old Testament situations, and bring them back to life in their own time, because what happened to Jerusalem in 586 BC, what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, these were all going to come back full cycle on John's own contemporary audience, you see. He's not speaking of something off into the future. He's saying this is telling his own nation, this is about to happen, okay? And the language of these texts would have had the reader in that time knowing that was coming from Jeremiah, okay? And other prophetic writings that we've looked at through the course of these studies, see? This is all looking at first century Jerusalem and a coming destruction and a mournful destruction of a great city that had once been the city of God but was now a harlot. And because of the rebellion in the city, because of the Zealot rebellion, Rome had reached a point where it would no longer tolerate this constant uprisings that was going on, and Nero said to Vespasian, go and destroy the city. And as the great turmoil took place with Nero's death, and the three interim emperors being sort of just wannabes that never accomplished anything, all died violently, Vespasian is declared emperor by his troops, and then it's agreed upon by the Senate, and then he takes his son Titus, who was a general at that time, and he commissions him to complete the job. And this Titus now becomes the destroyer, and he comes out of the abyss to bring the destruction upon the nation, upon the city. All right. I can't understand why anybody else but Titus would be called the destroyer, because he brought his 40 or 50,000 troops, whatever it was, to surround the city for 5 months. Devastation, death, putrefaction in the city, horror beyond belief. And then ultimately, after 5 months, in July, late July of 70 AD, they come and they completely destroy the city and the temple and burn it with fire. And this is everything John is showing us. Beloved, this is all first century reality, okay? This is all what Revelation is bringing us to, is whether we have 666 figured out, or whether we have some nuanced little statement or symbol or something figured out in this great revelation, is not the key. The keys are the clear indications of how Scripture is interpreting Scriptures, and we're getting insights from other scriptures of what this is intended to mean, and what we would call the time indicators, or the time texts that lead us to understand what exactly it is that John is seeing. Okay. Now I want to continue. I'm gonna leave it there with Revelation 18, so we can touch base on Revelation 19. And I'm not going into, again, to line by line depth in all of these various discussions, because I'm trying to focus on giving you the sense that this is something that is happening in our past and not in our future. Okay, so we saw this dirge, and coming to 19 gets very interesting again now, because heaven is rejoicing. It's not rejoicing because heaven loves tragedy or death or destruction. Heaven is rejoicing because Jesus is now, this harlot is being destroyed. The whole representation of this fallen nation, though it is regrettable, now the time of the kingdom has arrived. And so there is great rejoicing. And the salvation and glory and honor in Revelation 1 has now, as the reign of God is about to be completed, it says his judgments in verse 2 are righteous. He has judged the great harlot who is corrupting the land with her immorality, and he's avenged the blood of his bondservants. So these are what Luke called in Luke 21. These are the days of vengeance, you see. These are the days of vengeance. God is avenging his people for all the destruction that was levied and the persecution that was levied against them, both in the first century to the apostles, as well as their history. As Jesus had mentioned to them in Matthew 23, the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, you're going to be accountable for all the blood shed on the land. See, so this is God's time of vengeance. Okay, and then he talks about this great time of worship. Okay, you bless the small and the great, giving them vengeance, and there's a great sound of a multitude and sound of many waters, like the sound of a mighty peals of thunder, and they're screaming, they're just calling out, hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns, and the marriage of the Lamb is occurring. Now, if all of this, well, let's get a little bit farther. This is now the marriage of the Lamb is happening now. The old bride, the divorced woman who had turned harlotry has now been destroyed, has been killed off, and God's taking on a new bride, the bride of Christ. It's his new bride, and she's given to herself to clothe in fine linen, bright and clear, which is the righteous acts of the saint. And he says, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper. These are the true words of God. And I fell at his feet, that is the angel, John says, but he says to me, do not do that. I'm a fellow servant of yours. Your brethren who hold the testimony of Jesus, worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. See, so now this new prophetic focus is no longer of having to do with Israel, and that's a failure in evangelical Christianity, who's making Israel the center of all this prophecy in the future, and it is not. Jesus Christ himself is the focal point of all prophecy, the kingdom of God, and behold, and now in 11. Now this is important. It's kind of crazy, I know, but I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it was faithful and true, and righteousness he judges and wages war. His eyes are like a flame of fire. His head has many diadems, and his name written on him, which no one knows but himself, and he's clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and the armies of heaven are following after him. And in his mouth is a sharp sword that he will strike the nations and rule them with a rod of iron. This is this is the parousia. This is the arrival of Jesus in the first century. As we said in Matthew 22, he sent his armies and destroyed the city and set it on fire. This is all the coming of Jesus in the first century that this has all been leading up to. And again, no, it wasn't Jesus coming physically to stand on a mountain or anywhere. This is just the way he arrived in the Old Testament. He came down in the clouds of glory, okay, with his armies with him to bring this era, this old age to an end. Now, here's an important thing I want to point out to you. You may think I'm crazy by saying this, okay? You may think that none of this makes sense, but Jesus came in the first century in the same manner that he came in Isaiah 19:1. The Lord comes on a swift cloud, is about to come to Egypt, and he's going to bring all this chaos, okay? So in Isaiah 13, which is described as God is described as coming down. In Micah 1, he's described as coming down, touching the land that it melts. And these are all historical events, okay? But if we miss something here, okay, either Jesus did come, and this is an immediate event concurrent with the fall of Jerusalem, or we would have to say that, well, there's a gap. Now we've all of a sudden jumped from the fall of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. to some 2,000 years or more later, and this is now Jesus coming at the end of the world. You know, we're really good at gaps. We just like to throw gaps. Time doesn't permit me this session to go into Daniel 9. Maybe one of these days I will. You know, Daniel describes the historical events that will transpire over 490 years from the time of Persia to the time of Christ. And that's catapulted off in this future, and big time gaps are placed in by our popular eschatology. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't even get into all that right now. But one of the things that I think is important is if we go to Matthew 21, and in verse 39, he talks about the parable of the landowner. And of course, he talks about the rejection by the vine growers. And he talks about killing of the son and seizing the inheritance. So this all after Jesus dies. And then they took Jesus out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? And he said to them, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end, and he will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper season. Now stick with me. Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, verse 9, same parable. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers and give the vineyard to others. Luke chapter 20, same parable. Verse 16, same parable. What will the owner of the vineyard do to them? That's 15. 16. He will come and destroy those vine growers and give the vineyard to others. And when they heard this, they said, may it never be, the stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. I want you to notice something. All three of these parables, there's a certain sequence. They reject the son. They kill the son. The owner comes and destroys the vineyard. He comes. All three of these Gospels carry the same message. Okay? Rejection, murder of the son, destruction of the vineyard. That is followed by lending the vineyard out to others. Now, I'm suggesting this. If Jesus did not come in 70 A.D. in clouds of glory to destroy Jerusalem, then the vineyard has not been given out over to a new people to bear its fruit. we still have not inherited the kingdom. We still have not been given the stewardship of the vineyard or the kingdom, because we're saying that Jesus, now whatever we believe about the end of the world, that's another story. But right now I'm focusing on one thing. Jesus did come in 70 AD to destroy Jerusalem. If he didn't, then we don't have stewardship of the kingdom today. The church is not the steward of the kingdom. Jesus said that. There's these four pieces are in all three versions of that parable. And so we have to embrace the fact that what we're seeing concurrent with the destruction of the harlot here in Revelation 18 and this whole scene in 19 of Jesus coming down now on a white horse, all right, and the armies of heaven, then this has to be first century. This has to be Jesus' arrival, his what we called the parousia, the arrival, the coming of Jesus as he comes to himself to destroy the city and establish the kingdom. And I love the fact that in verse 15 it says, out of his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that he may not be, that he may strike the nations and rule them with a rod of iron, and treads down the winepress of the fierce wrath of Almighty God. And on his robe he has a name written, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Earlier it says that he had a name that no one but himself knows. See, in the old world, to name something meant to control it. It would give you a measure of control. Jacob tried it when he wrestled with the angel. He says, what's your name? He says, why are you asking? I'm just wonderful. And Jacob, because Jacob was a schemer. That was all his life. He'd been a schemer. He wanted to get his arms around this angel and get a name so that would give him insight to that person's character and give him a measure of control. It's very common. That's why dominion over the animals all the way back to the garden. Adam named them. See, it gave him a measure of dominion. That was the measure of dominion. But in Jesus here, they don't get to a name that, the only name that we're given, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's above everything. You can't control him. You can't decide for him. He is King of Kings, of all kings, and Lord of Lords. And this now is the beginning of his reign, that he will rule with the rod of iron. Now, I'm going to explain to you a little bit more about what that means, because some people say, well, Jesus is ruling now. Why are we in such a mess? Well, we're going to learn a little bit more about that, okay? But we're going to, for today, we're going to stop with this message. I know it was a shotgun blast. I know that this book can be very, very difficult. I hope that you take the time to go back over this a couple of times, see if you can get your head around it. And the book is there for you to read. It will give you a lot of insight to these things that I'm saying, and you can go back and read it over a few times. So I encourage you to pick up the book. It's available on paperback as well as ebook form. You can get it on Amazon or eSpark. So anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining in, and I hope you were able to get your hands around this. We're moving toward a close. We've got probably a few more sessions, and we'll be done with this whole set of podcasts on the book. So I hope that you're enjoying it. I hope you're learning something from it. God richly bless you, and thanks for joining.